People in coastal communities care about clean water, about safety from floods, and about the health of the environment that supports fish, shorebirds, and other wildlife populations. Today, more than ever, we hear about the need to protect and restore marshes and other wetland areas for the benefit of people and nature. This is the story of one community, Carpinteria, California, that took a weedy field that was often a dump site and restored it into the marsh that it once was. Carpinteria is a small seaside community in Southern California, about an hour north of Los Angeles. One of the community's precious attributes is a healthy, functioning marsh on the city's west end. A salt marsh is a wetland area filled with fresh water from the hills and salt water from the ocean. The Carpinteria Salt Marsh was once larger and covered much of the Carpinteria Valley, but agriculture, housing, and commercial development has filled about half of the wetland, including the weedy field on Ash Avenue. In fact, over 75% of Southern California's marshes have been destroyed to make way for development. This is the story of a forward-looking group of people, supplied with patience and perseverance, who came together to create a treasure for the community's use, a marsh nature park. It's a story about how scientific knowledge was used to create a delicately balanced ecosystem in which plants and animals thrive. And finally, it's a story about how people came to appreciate and learn about their coastal wetland, a place society has too often looked at as wasteland.
In ancient Chumash times, this site, known as Ash Avenue Wetlands, was a high-functioning marsh. After settlers came, it was used as a dump and a fill site and was degraded to a low-functioning condition. It still existed next to Carpinteria Salt Marsh, which remained in a high-functioning state.
The Ash Avenue field was zoned for residential development when, in 1987, a group of people got together to see if they could realize their dream of protecting the Carpinteria Salt Marsh and restoring portions that were degraded or destroyed. The group consisted of landowners of the adjacent marsh property, including the University of California, homeowners associations, representatives of the County Flood Control District, the City of Carpinteria, the Land Trust for Santa Barbara County, and local government officials. They looked at what was important for land protection and preservation and decided that the most important priority was the Ash Avenue site because it was zoned for development. It was also the best place to provide public access. Being within the city limits, it would allow the city to become a partner in management of the wetland. The University of California's manager of the Salt Marsh Reserve, Wayne Farron, met with the developer of the proposed condominium project and let him know that environmentalists would put up a fight to stop his project.
I met with a developer right here who had an option on buying this site to construct the 70 condominiums, and we had a long discussion about things such as my dead body and 10 years of litigation. I'm happy to say I'm still here, and so is Ash Avenue.
And about this time, a state proposition was passed that created funds to help parks and wildlife. About $1 million from this fund went toward the project, but a lot more money was still needed. Another important partner in the process was the State Coastal Conservancy. They work with jurisdictions like the City of Carpinteria to help them acquire land for coastal projects like this, and they funded the initial Marsh Park plan.
The Coastal Conservancy is a state agency. We're headquartered up in Oakland, but we work all up and down the coast and around San Francisco Bay, and our main missions is to keep the coast open to the public, provide ways for people to get to the beach, and to restore the natural resources that are up and down the coast. All of what we do is by invitation where we work.
There followed a series of fundraising efforts, grants and negotiations with the local property owners, and eventually 15 acres of land were purchased, 8 of which became the city's Carpinteria Salt Marsh Nature Park.
we work with private landowners to find a solution to their long-term needs. In many cases, it may be estates that need to be cashed out for tax purposes. It may be families with many ownership interests and the inability to liquidate that ownership interest for those that wish to no longer own it.
Another source of funds was transportation money from the federal government.
They finally decided, I guess, that it was also important not just to fund bridges and widen roads, but they felt we also better save a little bit of money from our transportation dollars to do enhancements to make the transportation experience a little bit better. And because this project is near the freeway, the water that runs into the Carpinteria Salt Marsh is runoff from the freeway. There was a nexus between restoring this and the adjacent 101 freeways.
Additional funds came from other state, county, and private sources. On October 9th, 1996, the key players came together to celebrate the final acquisition of parcels for the park.
It's a classic example of the city, and they certainly deserve a great deal of credit, working well with the county, working with the state and the Coastal Conservancy, Coastal Commission, and the private owners as well.
Once you have your legislators behind a project, things start to happen. And without your legislators behind a project, they don't happen.
The pressure upon the coast for lovely development sites is going to double between now and 20 or 30 years from now. So the fact that this site, which would have been condominiums without this partnership's work, is important to untold numbers of people. But not only people, many future generations of us folks as well as those folks are celebrating today.
Take a shovel.
Finally, after 10 years of committee meetings, fundraising, negotiations, and planning, groundbreaking ceremonies took place in 1997.
This has been a joint project, and it's going to be a really classy joint when it gets done, I'll tell you. We're really looking forward to it. To me, this project represents real progress. This is what I consider tremendously progressive thinking, that we have progressed enough to realize the value in this wonderful natural area and to take our money and our time and our hearts to restore it to what it once was, and I think has always been meant to be.
Much of the success of this project is due to the fact that virtually everyone on the committee in 1987 continues today on the committee in the year 2000, providing a continuity of vision. The design process began with the steering committee and consultants developing design criteria. Design alternatives went through the Carpinteria Planning Commission, Carpinteria City Council, public workshops, and hearings. So the ultimate design is a combination of the committee's desires, the consultant's suggestions, the public input, and the permitting process.
Historic photos were used as a starting point for the design, but it wasn't an attempt to recreate exactly what was there, but rather to replicate the types of habitats that are in the adjoining marsh. Some of the key elements to consider were the flow of water, land grading in order to have slopes and banks, and the position of the channels and cobble beds. Part of the reason for a marsh park is to give the public access to a highly functioning marsh. Public access to the adjacent marsh reserve is limited because of the ongoing scientific studies and concern for damage to fragile habitat. The Marsh Park was an opportunity to create a place for meaningful access that is adjacent to the marsh habitat but doesn't interfere with plant and animal life. In addition to the goal of marsh restoration and marsh access, the goal has been to use the marsh as an opportunity to teach the public about the natural forces at play in the community. The committee developed a concept plan. Then an engineering firm was hired to create the implementation plan.
It was important to have an engineering firm as the lead design contractor. By having the hydraulics and grading correct, this allowed the biology to take over and work properly.
In this part of the marsh, there had been channels which were dug out. They'd been silted in, and they did that by bringing in equipment and working it on pallets so that the existing functioning part of the marsh around it wasn't damaged. And then in the new part of the marsh, where all of the fill had been excavated to create an area that could be submerged in water. The channels were done in a natural, organic sort of layout.
The project started as an ad hoc committee, but when the city of Carpinteria became involved, it became a formal city committee, and the project was developed by the city's Public Works Department. The city hired Union Construction to be the contractor. The final cost for the creation of habitats through restoration and enhancement was more than $1 million. Before the bulldozers arrived, the community came out to save many of the existing creatures on the site, including crabs, snails, and various plants. The project began with the removal of 1,000 dump truck loads of dirt and trash that had been dropped off on this site over a period of years. One of the subcontractors was a landscape architectural firm.
In the course of the design for the project, we wanted to be inspired by that which is found here already. And that's not just limited to the plant materials, but also to the building materials. So the interpretive center and so forth are constructed of the native sandstone from this area, and if you look at the mountain backdrop, you can see how we were inspired by that building material. The benches on the project are going to look like driftwood for people to sit on.
And as the site was dug out, rocks were uncovered which were used to help construct the interpretive centers.
You can see the relationship that this interpretive area will have to the marsh. It'll be right up to the edge, so you can be looking directly down into it. At this particular location, there will be a restoration or a new habitat created to reintroduce an endangered plant called the salt marsh bird's beak.
The plant establishment has gone just as well as we can hope in most areas. Some areas it's been more than we'd like. We're in a very diverse part of the upper marsh here. We've got pickleweed, we've got saltgrass, Parrish's glasswort, we've got a big salt bush called brewer's salt bush, alkali heath, and a parasitic native plant called dodder. That's dodder on pickleweed.
There are also several plants that have special significance to the Chumash Indians, who once had villages in this area.
For thousands of years, Chumash people have been relying on plants as a means of shelter, medicinal uses, food, and basket material. And we want to preserve these plants. Here we have juncus. This was a plant that was used for basket material. The juncus was split and twined around more juncus as used as coils and woven into beautiful baskets. Around me here is willow. Willow was used for building our houses, the op. The larger branches of the willow were used for the main braces of the house. It was a dome-shaped hut. Willow was also used as a headache remedy. The bark was made into a tea. Here we have the wild rose. The petals of the flower were dried and used on the baby's bottom because of their fragrant smell. The rose hips were eaten. They were eaten raw, dried, and made into a tea because of their sweet flavor. And here we have the wild sunflower. The seeds that came out of the flower were eaten raw. As tradition goes, the golden poppy coupe replaced the eyes of a person who had just recently deceased, and the poppy was used to light their way into the land of the dead.
While the final park looks natural and functions well, it took a lot of hard work and planning to get it this way.
You're seeing bare soil, an irrigation system that will be used temporarily to get some of the plants established. But eventually, this area, which now has a medium tide in it, will have a series at low tide of channel, mudflat, pickleweed marsh, high marsh, palustrine scrub wetland, upland scrub, and grassland areas. The upland area is largely a landscape effort with native plants that will mature to appear to be a natural site. The wetland area is an ecological restoration project with scientific experimentation involved in trying to establish all the ecosystem functions that we have proposed to establish here in this restored portion of the estuary. These two upland and wetland projects theoretically will come together and be indistinguishable in their transition from one to the other.
Historically, Local creeks deposited rocks and boulders in the area, so an artificial cobble area of rocks and boulders were recreated for mussels, oysters, and other aquatic organisms, similar to the habitat that occurs in the mouth of the salt marsh today.
There are also wonderful feeding areas at low tide for birds because of all the crabs and other invertebrate animals that are part of the food chain that occurs at Carpinteria Salt Marsh.
One of the design issues was the amount of wetland versus upland. As natural transitions and upland marsh habitats are rare, the design committee decided to recreate an upland edge habitat. This decision also had economic benefits because it was cheaper to remove less earth. In addition, the value of the upland habitat included the ability to create public access trails and interpretive areas that would not have been possible if the entire property was converted to wetland.
It's not a land for meanies, though, so keep your voices down. Don't point or shout at wildlife, and leave rocks on the ground.
The sand dunes at Carpinteria once covered most of the coast. At the salt marsh, they were formed by waves breaking over the Carpinteria reef, dropping sand, forming sandbars. As the sandbars developed high enough, wind-blown dunes formed. These dunes were once very extensive and were covered with many native plants and animals.
A boardwalk was built in the marsh park to allow public access through the reconstructed dune area without disturbing it. The construction of the nature park was more than just an aesthetic improvement and access to the general public. It was also a unique opportunity for important scientific experiments and ecosystem monitoring. It was an opportunity to apply the information learned about how marshes work to see if this information could be successful in helping to create a new functioning marsh ecosystem. Not only was it a matter of monitoring the amount of vegetation that occurred and how many species of fish came into the marsh park, but to compare it with the neighboring, well-established marsh. The University of California is in charge of managing the marsh, and one of the 20 different management programs is the Endangered Species Recovery Program. Dave Hubbard has been supervising the recovery of the endangered birdsbeak in the marsh park.
Salt marsh birdsbeak has successfully made it through 2 seasons at this site. All the elements for its survival seem to be in place. There are appropriate host plants, the appropriate hydrology, the salt in the soil. Actually, the plants are healthiest when there is salt present in the system. When there's salt in the soil and salt water deposited on the leaf surfaces, it prevents the insects that normally would eat them from consuming the leaves when they're covered with salt.
University scientist Andy Brooks is finding that fish are also using the new nature park.
By using nets and traps to catch and then count the fish, we've actually determined that both groups of fish are found here. The fish that spend their entire life within the marsh and also the fish that come and go from the ocean into the marsh. In fact, we found a higher number of young fish here in the nature park than we found anywhere else in the reserve.
Along with the fish have come birds, egrets, sandpipers, ducks, and the great blue heron. They feed on the fish as well as crabs, frogs, and the microorganisms in the mud.
In just the 3 years that this park has existed, there have been more than 70 species found here. In fact, I found one this morning that I hadn't seen here before. This upland area that we're sitting on right now is full of sparrows and finches now. And back of me now are the water birds, that is the wading birds, the sandpipers, and the larger wading birds, which are egrets and herons.
Christine Sandoval has been studying the return of rare butterflies to the upland area of the new marsh, and what she's learning is now being applied in other areas.
We've been studying the butterflies at the Carpinteria Salt Marsh. We basically wanted to know what they eat, how many species we have, and whether we have any rare or endangered species. What we found was that in the Carpinteria Salt Marsh Reserve, we have several species of butterflies that depend on the marsh, but they also depend on the upland area above the marsh. They need to feed on nectar, and you can only find nectar on those plants that grow above the marsh. If you can look around the marsh, you don't see flowers on the marsh area. You see the flowers growing what we call upland. So you'll notice that when you visit the park that there's a lot of flowers and a lot of color. All of these are actually food for butterflies. They feed on any plant, but they have one plant in particular that they really like. It's called golden bush. The golden bush provides the nectar for the two most interesting butterflies of the marsh. These are the western pygmy blue, and that's the smallest butterfly in the whole world we have right here in the Carpinteria Salt Marsh Reserve. The golden bush also provides nectar for the wandering skipper. That's a brown little moth that only lives on salt marshes. It's very rare. In fact, it's considered threatened. If you want to become a butterfly watcher like me, all you have to do is get a butterfly guidebook and come to a place like the nature park and look for butterflies and try to identify them. It's very fun.
And this man, by gathering and analyzing snails, is part of a team that has developed a relatively simple method to determine the health of the entire marsh without the need to count fish, birds, or plants. And his method has to do with the life cycle of the trematode worm.
To determine whether the marsh is healthy, we'd like to know whether we have lots of birds and fishes and clams and crabs, but those are difficult to count. Counting the trematode parasites that live in the snails gives us an easy, simple way, an indirect way, but another way of measuring whether all those animals are present and using the habitat.
On warm days, the worms leave the snail and swim in the water, where they penetrate clams, crabs, and fish, which become the secondary hosts.
The trematode sits on the surface of a fish's brain. It releases chemicals into that fish's brain, which makes that fish do all sorts of foolish things from a fish's perspective. It makes the fish, for example, swim up to the surface or turn over on its side so that it exposes its white belly. And these things make the fish much more susceptible to being preyed on by birds who notice a fish that's acting strangely and then fly over and eat it. Birds become infected when they feed on a parasitized host. The worms live in the gut of the bird, and they pass their eggs out with the feces of the bird onto the mudflat, where the eggs then come in contact with the snail and complete the life cycle.
So rather than counting fish or birds and other animals to determine the health of the marsh, scientists now crack open a sample area of snails and count the amount of trematode worms. And if there are a lot of worms, it indicates a healthy, parasite-rich marsh. In other words, a healthy, functioning food chain. Finally, 13 years after the first ad hoc committee met, it was time for the formal opening of the Carpinteria Salt Marsh Nature Park. Plants, fish, birds, and scientists are not the only happy users of the park. It's become a popular park for both the community and tourists.
It's been a wonderful success. It's worth the long road it takes to get here. The park is loved by the neighborhood. It is visited by people all over the state and probably even the nation.
The benefit to the public of having this particular marsh park is access. You can sum it up in one word, access. Of course, there are some good reasons for the public not to have access to the middle of the marsh. There's a reason why the university restricts access to guided tours, and that is to protect the sensitive species that live there.
Puffy clouds with cores of mist desperately...
The marsh has been embraced by a wide variety of people for a variety of purposes. The amphitheater is used for poetry readings, weddings, and memorial services. People come here to paint, stroll the paths, and relax.
Another benefit the community's gotten out of this is one that brought people together to form a docent committee and to have poetry readings and to help and learn with each other, and really gotten the people to focus on what they have here, learn about it, and get active in protecting it. I think it's a wonderful thing when the community starts to own their natural resources and feel like they're the ones who can learn about it and talk about it and bring their children here, bring the school children here, and feel what is important and know what is important about why this was preserved.
The docents are an important element of leading weekly guided tours, providing information and interpretation of the new wetland.
The value of a marsh in general, there are many economic values. If you look up in the hills, you can see that a lot of water drains down into this area. Where you have a lot of water, you can have a lot of flooding. And if you keep the land in marshland, the flooding can be contained more than if it's all paved and overflowing. So marshes are well known for flood control. They're well known for filtering out pollutants before they get out into the ocean. and they're known as nurseries for commercial fish, like halibut, who come up here and rest and then go out there and get caught so you and I can eat them. A new economic value has become tourism. And marshes attract a lot of birds, and I've read that birding is the fastest growing sport in America these days. People like to come and look at birds. You got a marsh here, you got a place to look at them, that's economic value.
It's sometimes heard that nothing good gets designed by a committee. The Carpinteria Salt Marsh Nature Park is quite to the contrary. Members of the committee brought planning expertise, fundraising expertise, political expertise, scientific background. The project was a community effort from the beginning. A combination of science and community vision made this a great success.
The Carpinteria Marsh Park is an example to other communities of what can be done with a vision, perseverance, and consistency. It is also a demonstration that restoration can work with public access included.
I think other communities could take this primary lesson out of this project, which is look far and wide for your money and for your friends. I know that people who are interested in preserving the environment often have a view, particularly of government agencies, that they're not going to be helpful. In fact, they may be just the opposite. But if you think of where the money came from for this project, there was a slew of government agencies. Don't be intimidated by the names of various agencies. There's only people behind those agencies. So you got to look under every stone and you'll find a pot of money.
I think a very important lesson for other communities that have the opportunity to preserve open space in their community is that they really need to stick to it. It often seems like it's an impossible task. The amount of money that's required to do it seems astronomical, but I think the lesson is that you really need to stick to it. Eventually you'll see that money comes from places you'd least expect it, and inevitably the community will get behind a project like this. And with community support, you're unstoppable.
One could take the lesson out of this that if you still do have wetlands, don't let them be filled. Fight as hard as you can to keep them the way they are, so you won't spend 20 years and $5 million just trying to turn them back into what they were once.